afternoon. My name is Micah Dominguez, and today I will be introducing the foundational concept of legal authority in a society and the sources of law. Understanding the sources helps us see where the law comes from and how they affect our everyday lives. We'll define what we mean by sources of law, identify 5 principal types, and then take a closer look into one in particular, which is executive orders. Sources of law are the origins from which laws derive their authority. They are the structures and institutions that give legal rules legitimacy and enforceability within a society. In other words, the answer to the question, where does the law come from? The 5 sources of law are constitutional law, statutory law, administrative law, case law, and then finally, the one that we're going to be talking about, executive orders. Today, we will be focusing specifically on executive orders, a unique and sometimes controversial source of law. We'll explore what they are, how they work, and the role they play in shaping public policy, as well as comparing them to other principal sources. And now I'll be introducing our first speaker.
Hello, my name is Geronemo Dominguez, and I would like to begin by explaining what the other 4 sources of law are. Constitutional law. Constitutional law is the foundation of all U.S. law. It's basically, as you would think, the Constitution, what our forefathers wrote. It is unbending to anything or anyone. There's no source of law that comes higher than our constitutional law. Each state has their own constitution. Some people don't know this. I didn't know this, but we all do. Contrary to our constitution, each state's constitution is allowed to be rewritten and amended as many times as that state deems necessary, whereas our constitution has only been amended a total of 17 times in the 200 years it's been alive, and in addition to the adoption of the Bill of Rights. Moving on, we have statutory law. Statutory law is passed by Congress. A statute is the lawmaking of the legislature. The entire criminal law, the law applicable to sales of goods, and almost all limiting of regulating businesses, activities making up the statutory law. Basically, they are all the laws that come into play that are in our code of law. Enactments are made through the legal system, and these enactments are also called ordinances. Statutory law is very much governed by courts and other agencies, which we will now get into. Administrative law. This is the independent agencies. Rules that are made by agencies can be enforced, and the fact that agency rules are 100% enforceable. The government has the right to give the authority to agencies to govern certain areas. These independent agencies are not part of the executive government, but are still allowed to govern. There's a specific code that people are allowed, that our Congress is allowed to give these agencies by, and this is basically the adequate standards. Congress must give or provide adequate standards or guidelines in the statute creating the agency. These standards are very vague and are easily delegated, but when they are delegated, they carry the full weight of the law and enforceability. Rules that are made by the agencies are 100% actionable by the authorities who put them there, and this is also, an example of this is the FDA or the EPA regulations. Moving on. We have case law and common law. These laws are used to settle disputes that no statute or law prior to the dispute have been made, and they also create precedents. And the idea that these precedents follow is stare decisis. Common law and case law, stare decisis, my bad. This arises when the courts are called upon to resolve the disputes by which there is no statute or law establishing a rule. Chancery is the form of law allowed for equitable remedies not available to the common law courts. While most states have dispensed with a separate court of chancery, their courts are free to seek equitable solutions when strict adherence to the established law would bring about grave injustice. Case law is a whole matter that is definable by Judge Judy. Judge Judy has been someone who has been in common law and case law for a long time. Moving on to our executive orders. Our executive orders are orders given out by our executive branch, specifically the president. This is the president's directives are legally binding and completely enforceable, obviously. We have a couple examples of Trump's latest executive focuses, which have been mainly toward our educational system. As you can see here, we have at least 3 that are namely saying what is going to be the restructuring of our educational system as of April. We also have an example from President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1943, which is an order contracting war supplies to include a clause prohibiting race discrimination. Continuing.
I'm going to be talking about executive orders. I'm Isabel, and we're going to take a deeper dive into actually what executive orders are. They are mainly run by the President of the United States. They help to manage operations in the federal government, and they also help to carry out constitutional duties and limit scope and authority. One of the top things of executive orders is the second article of the Constitution, and it states that the president is the head of the executive branch, so therefore he is head of deciding of executive orders. These help to grant power to enforce laws, direct federal agencies, and oversee implementation of policies. If we actually take a look in Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution, it states that the president must take care that the laws be faithfully executed, in that they need to be lawful and that they can't be obviously unlawful. Constitutional approval. Executive laws do not need to be approved by the Congress. They are different from laws, how they need to go through a process and then be executed by Congress in order for it to be implemented to the public. If executive orders have issues with them, they can be limited or modified in order to meet lawful reasons. This also helps funding decisions and legislative actions as well. The next thing is that executive orders are very powerful, but they do not have a direct effect on enforcing laws. They help interpret the laws that are already in place, and they don't create new ones that are already there. They help to lay out the outline for policies and procedures of the federal government, and they help to just clarify already the laws that are set into place. An example of this is President Truman's 1948 executive law, where he had desegregation in the U.S. military. Executive laws can also be overturned in 2 main areas, either courts or future presidents. In our courts, if the executive order is deemed unlawful, they can obviously be overturned by the judicial branch and can be striked out. They also need to follow the same process as the law does, but in the end step, they don't need to be approved by Congress. An example of this was when Truman ordered a seize on steel mills in the Korean War, and the U.S. Supreme Court deemed this as unlawful and just nixed it altogether. Another reason is future presidents. Future presidents, when they come into office, can obviously undo or alter policies of past presidents and can do what they want with their executive order if it's lawful. Example of this is the Biden-Trump administration. When Biden got into office, he changed Trump's, and now Trump is changing Biden's, and this is a good example of that.
So, executive orders versus other sources. First, I'd like to start with statutes. Executive orders in comparison to statutes. Executive orders are much quicker to issue, and a president can draft and sign executive orders without waiting for Congress to debate, vote, or approve it. Secondly, executive orders in comparison to case law. Executive orders direct federal agencies and officials on how to act. They are about action and administration, where case law is created by the courts and is about interpreting the laws, less about action. Judges resolve disputes and set legal precedents that others must follow. The main difference is that executive orders are proactive. They are setting policies for the government to carry out, whereas case law is reactive, where they are responding to disputes and deciding what the law means and determining that and implementing it into cases that are coming to the court. Thirdly, executive orders compared to the Constitution. Executive orders must operate within the limits of the Constitution. A president cannot use an executive order to override constitutional rights or powers. Also, if an executive order violates the Constitution, it can be struck down by the courts. This is a check on the president's power. The overall point is that executive orders must comply with the Constitution. They are powerful but are not above the supreme law of the land. Finally, executive orders in comparison to administrative laws. Executive orders often direct administrative agencies to take action, set priorities, or focus on certain policy goals. Administrative law is the detailed body of rules and regulations that agencies themselves create, such as EPA environmental rules or the FDA drug regulations. The difference between the two is that executive orders can steer agencies or tell them how to act, but the agencies still control the technical details through administrative lawmaking. Overall, executive orders are faster and more flexible than statutes. They direct action, unlike case law, which interprets the law, and they must stand within constitutional boundaries. They also influence but don't replace agency regulations. Now, I have a short story that will help you remember this concept. Imagine the US government like a kingdom. One day, the president needs to act quickly, so they pull out a special tool, the executive order. But before using it, the president looks around and sees four powerful neighbors. Congress writing the statutes, slow but firm. The judges creating the case law, interpreting what the law means. The Constitution constantly reminding the president, you can't act, but only within my limits. And then finally, the fourth neighbor, agencies making administrative rules, detailed, technical, and ongoing. The president uses executive orders to act fast. It doesn't make new laws like Congress or interpret laws like judges, but it guides action within the executive branch. It must follow the Constitution and can help steer agencies. To conclude, executive orders are powerful, but they work within a system well. Thank you.
Thank you, Landen Scott. My name is Kendal Baxmeyer, and my section is focused on executive orders of the past. I'm talking about two real-world examples of old executive orders passed by presidents that had a significant impact on our country. The orders that I decided to incorporate are Executive Order 9981, issued by President Harry S. Truman in 1948, and Executive Order 966, issued by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1942 during World War II. In 1948, the U.S. military was still racially segregated. Black soldiers who had served with honor in World War II were placed in separate units, often given menial jobs and denied the same opportunities as other soldiers. This was a time when Jim Crow laws were still widely in effect in the South, and many members of Congress had no interest in advancing the civil rights of minority soldiers. Truman realized this problem and decided to act anyway. Facing pressure from civil rights leaders and veterans of the time, Truman recognized the contradiction of fighting for freedom abroad while denying it at home. He signed Executive Order 9981, which declared, "There shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin." This was a major moment in American history. Truman didn't go through Congress because he knew many lawmakers, especially Southern Democrats, would block it. Instead, he used his executive authority to force the military to begin integrating. This decision marked the beginning of the end of segregation in the U.S. military. It set up the President's Committee on Equality of Treatment and Opportunity in the Armed Services, which oversaw implementation. By early 1950s, integration was underway, and during the Korean War, black and white troops fought together on the front lines. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. It had real immediate impact, and it proved something powerful. A president can use executive authority to lead on civil rights when Congress refuses to act. Truman's order not only transformed the military, it helped lay the groundwork for broader civil rights movement that would follow in the 1950s and 60s. Just as we saw executive order used to grant rights, they can also be used to restrict them. Executive Order 9066, signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1942, was an order that authorized the forced removal of Japanese Americans and other individuals deemed a threat to national security from the West Coast to internment camps. At the time, the country was still reeling from the attack on Pearl Harbor. Fear, anger, and suspicion against Japanese Americans were spreading rapidly across the West Coast. Many politicians and military leaders were worried about espionage, even though there was no strong evidence that Japanese Americans posed any real threat. Under these pressures, Roosevelt acted quickly and signed Executive Order 9066. The order gave military commanders the authority to declare areas of the country as military zones from which anyone could be excluded. Within months, approximately 120,000 men, women, and children of Japanese descent, most of whom were American citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes. They were allowed to take only what they could carry. Many had to sell their businesses, farms, and homes for a fraction of their value, or simply abandon them. Executive Order 9066 is a long-standing example that shows how quickly civil liberties can be removed when fear overrides constitutional protections. When we put these two executive orders side by side, an important truth becomes very clear. Executive orders bypass the slow, gridlocked legislative process. They give the president the ability to respond quickly, for better or for worse. In the case of Truman and Executive Order 9981, executive power was used to advance civil rights and resolve a major injustice inside our military. In the case of Roosevelt and Executive Order 9066, executive power was used to violate the rights of thousands of innocent Americans. Both orders had immediate effects. Both orders reshaped American lives. And both show us how enormous and risky executive power can be.
Thank you, Ken. My name is Bracken, and I'm talking about which source of law is the most influential today. And I think you make a compelling point that executive orders are really immediate, and they can have good effects and they can have bad effects. And so executive orders aren't enacted without consequence, but they do provide an immediate response. Now, with them being increasingly visible and even more immediate, we see in today's society, administrations having pretty radical ideas, and they're passing a lot of executive orders. President Trump has already signed 137 this year, where Congress has only passed 5 bills. So, Congress is pretty slow, and executive orders kind of fill in the place where Congress stalls. And I think that's a pretty good indicator of an efficient government and an efficient executive branch, that they're taking action to meet the needs of the public. It's a quick answer to the opinions of the public, and while you can contact your local congressman, he's not going to do something about it right away. And so executive orders are a quicker way to make those opinions, real. For example, DOGE was implemented this January, and already we have seen billions of dollars of fraud and reckless government spending, and I think we can really acknowledge that with an executive order, or without it, in fact, this fraud wouldn't have been exposed from the previous administration, and they can be really important. Also, Trump is cutting U.S. aid spending, including the biggest portion from Ukraine, about $1.4 billion in tax and spending cuts. That's really significant for a war of that magnitude. It takes a lot to fund it, and that's a lot of money for Europe. And especially with the Corporate Transparency Act that Biden passed in 2021, it required U.S. businesses to report beneficial ownership to the Financial Crimes and Enforcement Network. And President Trump recently reversed that. And so only foreign entities are required to do that now. And so we can see an immediate impact about reversing different opinions from administration to solving big problems in the U.S. government. So that would that would about sum up why executive orders are great. Thank you.
Alright, my name is Sandoval, and just to close, pretty much a conclusion overview of what we have learned. Pretty much basic definition that we can derive from this is that the POTUS, or the President of the United States, directives to manage federal government operations. And we saw this was outlined in Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. Some key features that we outlined during this presentation about executive orders are that they do not require Congress approval. They enable the President to direct federal agencies, outline policies, and clarify laws. And they can be overturned by courts or future POTUS, which is Presidents of the United States. Relating it to the other sources of law, like we introduced in the beginning of the presentation, we see that like similar to the constitutional law, executive orders derive from the second article of the Constitution, but like the constitutional law, they must also be constitutional and must follow all the things that are outlined during that article. We see in statutory law that executive orders clarify congressional laws, but they do not create new ones. So, many people are critical of executive orders because they see that as the president abusing their power. But actually, they do not create any new laws that will not be supported by the majority of Congress. They just clarify and just pretty much interpret it so that it's easier to understand. Administrative law, we see direct agency enforcement rules, similar how we see what Trump has done in his administration, how he has directed the agency of the Department of Education and most of these governments agencies to revise their laws and their current rules. He has done executive orders to make sure that these agencies are actually enforcing these rules and they're not participating in fraud or abuse. And then similar case law, we see that judicial presidents invalidate or limit executive orders, like we saw in the Truman case. There's actually executive orders that have passed that have been outlawed because there was a precedent established by a court case. It was a judicial court, appellate court, or even the Supreme Court, and they were overturned just because there was a precedent established, like we learned in class. So it was overturned because this was established, and this is seen in case law. Some key features that were pointed out from the executive orders, going back to that, like we said, they don't require Congress approval, and because this is, currently we have a president that is very partisan, and many people have pointed out that maybe the Congress majority is very slim, and because of this, the executive orders that Trump has passed in his past 3 months of his administration, they have been very divisive of the country, and this has led to many criticism. So that one leads us into the positives and the negatives of the executive orders. So just to point out some of the positives, it would be efficiencies, the first one, which would be that, like how Landen pointed out, they do implement rapid policies into Congress, without Congress, and they also allow for swift responses to crises or needs. Kind of the example that he said with the kingdom. If the country was like a kingdom, and we had a crisis that we had to go fix very quickly, executive orders could have that power to fix it very, very fastly and swiftly. We have flexibility, which is the president can clarify or adapt laws through an executive order. And then they also ensure that governance is effective. All these agencies are actually running swiftly in the way they should. They are not cutting funding to stuff that they need, and they're also funding organizations or things around the world that we do not need. We have direct authority, which is that forces strengthen their ability to enforce these laws that have been passed by Congress. And this is obviously fulfilling the constitutional duties that derive from Article 2 and Article 1 of the Constitution. And then lastly, they just advance policies, which is a very good thing. They enable societal changes when Congress is stalled. We often see threats of the government shutting down because partisans debates are ongoing. So even if Congress were to shut down, as they say, the government were to shut down, executive orders still have power. Even when Congress is not working, they can still pass things that may need to be passed in that moment. Some negatives that we have noticed is that the limited scope. They cannot create new laws or override Congress. Many of us may support many of the actions done by the current administration, but there's also a whole other side of the country that does not. So limited, either right now maybe we wish that executive orders could create a new law or pass a law that maybe we would agree with as Christians or something, but there's still the other side of the country that does not agree. So this is kind of a negative or a positive depending on how you see it. Another negative is the temporary nature, easily revoked by the future presidents. As we saw, as Bracken pointed out, there have been many overturns of executive orders, like we saw the Biden administration overturned many of Trump's executive orders, which led to, as we saw, the border crisis that we experienced for the past 4 years, and many other, even the Ukraine war, where Trump had done steps to cut funding to foreign countries, and Biden overturned that by sending close to $250 billion to fund the war in Ukraine. And this is, Trump has done the same thing in his current administration, which on day one he again withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord, as we saw that Biden had joined again in his administration, and he also withdrew from the World Health Organization. So it can move very swiftly and very quickly depending on the administration, especially if the next president is a different party from the previous. Another negative is the potential overreach. We saw in the Truman case where actually the executive order was overturned by the Supreme Court because they ruled it as unconstitutional. So it leads to a risk of exceeding constitutional authority, and that's why it leads to the judicial branch having to get involved. And lastly, we just see a lack of congressional oversight. Bypassing Congress can undermine democratic checks, and this was something that our founders established to make sure that we did not become a monarchy. So even some presidents have tried to do things that may seem more like a king would do, but there's obviously a negative. And then just final key takeaways, we notice that obviously, like many executive orders are just a powerful tool for the president. It's not their only power that they have many powers, and they are commander-in-chief. But executive orders are a tool that is very useful, especially in times of crisis. They do enable quick action and they clarify policies. Like how we've seen the Trump administration has been very transparent on many things that we did not know of. Like, for example, the USAID funding that they have cut, which they found with Doge, as Bracken pointed out. These things the American public was not very aware of. And executive orders like the ones Trump passed have enabled the Americans to see and be more transparent and actually clarify the policies that have been established by past presidents. And another one is executive orders are very susceptible to reversal and potential for overreach. Like we saw the Trump case and the Biden case, they are very partisan in their decisions, so they obviously just pretty much play the game of handing it to the next president and just switch to everything that the previous president did with executive orders. This might lead to political instability and even an economic downfall, and this also shows that executive orders can be a bit dangerous when not used properly. And lastly, they just really highlight the need for judicial and legislative checks to maintain checks and balances, which is the foundation of our government, which the founders established, and they wanted it this way, so that no branch was more powerful than the other. We see that the executive orders done by the executive branch may seem like authoritarian or something, but the Congress is there, and the judicial branch is also there to maintain the checks and balances like the founders intended. So that is all for today. Appreciate it, and thank you.
Hey, so this is a last little segment just about how our faith integrates into executive orders and how it personally applies to each one of us. So firstly, with me, executive orders can have an effect on me as a U.S. Army soldier because the president can issue different decrees that happen over time that could not align with faith or my faith or could not align with the Constitution. And I need to be on my guard, especially being in the Army, with watching out for these executive orders and make sure that they do align with what the Bible says and what the Constitution says for our nation. So one verse that has helped me just constantly stay in tune with the Bible is Joshua 1:8, which is, keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night so that you may be careful to do everything that is written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. So I think that just keeping that verse on my mind and applying that to any executive order that the president passes will just help me to understand, see if this order is actually something good, is something that I should follow, or if it's something that I should stand up against and make sure that the president isn't overstepping his power.
Moving on from that, thank you, Lando. My name is Isaiah Dominguez again. And executive orders, how it does affect our walk as Christians is very vital now, and they'll be very vital in the next coming years with all of the craziness of election, world wars, and all that. We do thank Lando for his service and his future service that he's going to be having, and that he has his Christ-centered view on his position. However, for us who are civilians, I plan on being a civilian all my life until I get drafted. We really need to look at it and say, if there's an executive order that contradicts our faith, how should we respond? There are millions around the world, and many more in history, who have been martyrs against their regimes and everything, who have died for the spreading of the gospel. It's the hope and the prayer of each Christian that they would be able to spend their lives giving and spreading the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I pray for my personal self that if the time comes that there's an executive order or a command from the land, that I would have the boldness to stand up against it. That would be for the kingdom of Christ.
Thank you, Geronimo. I'm Bracken, and Romans 13 talks about the governing authorities, how God created them and we're supposed to submit to them. And executive orders are one of those things where we're going to have to obey it in some way if it applies to us. And I think they noted very well that if there's something that conflicts with our faith, that we're going to have to take action and, protect our faith, because that is ultimately the most important thing. And our identity is in Christ, and so that can't get in the way of, doing something that is politically wrong or biblically wrong. So I think that's important to remember as well.
Christ is King. Thank you very much.